Something happened during the 2008 presidential elections. White men and women voted in large numbers than ever before for an African-American candidate. When Tom Bradley and Jesse Jackson ran for office in the 1980s, pollsters noticed the troubling trend. Not wanting to appear racist, a cross-section of whites told researchers that they supported the African-American candidates. But when they got to the voting booth, a statistically significant number pulled the lever next to the white candidate's name. During the 2008 Democratic primaries, the so-called Bradley effect seemed to lose its edge, as white voters, especially young and better educated, said they would vote for Obama and did. While race played a bigger factor in the general election than it did in the primaries, there was not a massive election day defection of white voters to John McCain and the Republican side. This change in electoral behavior had something to do with the 8 long years of the Bush presidency, the souring economy, and Obama himself. But to a larger degree, it stemmed from the growing desire for some in the United States, again especially upper middle class whites, to live in a post-racial world, a world where they could act like race no longer mattered. To show that race doesn't matter, however, race matters a whole lot. By voting for Obama, some whites tried to suggest that they had transcended race, and that the issue no longer mattered to them, that they had achieved a kind of enlightened state of colorblindness. Yet Obama's apparent blackness remained crucial in this transformation. For those seeking the appearance of colorblindness, you could only show that you had moved beyond race in the political realm by voting for an African American or maybe Latino candidate. Race doesn't matter, race matters. This dynamic of desired colorblindness isn't just about politics. It's perhaps even more strongly and consistently expressed in what we buy. Starbucks, somewhat of a fallen star these days, began its ascent to the top of the commercial heap, just as the appeal of post-racialism and apparent colorblindness spread. From the 1980s onward, the company understood quite clearly the middle-class desire to show others that race didn't matter for them, and how they used race to make this point. Like every marketable desire, post-racial consumption has a history. Just after World War II, Gunnar Myrdal published his study, The American Dilemma. White prejudice, the Swedish economist concluded, resulted in discrimination against African Americans and the distortion of the American creed of melting pot equality. By the 1960s, Myrdal was somewhat out of favor. While civil rights activists talked about changing the hearts and minds of whites, after Little Rock, most weren't holding their collective breath for this to happen. They sought to change the law first. Pushed by sit-ins at lunch counters and Easter Day marches across bridges, Congress ended legal segregation in 1965. Over the next few years, and I know I'm simplifying here, the Black Power movement emerged, and the question of the wisdom of integration, and even more, the desired decency of America was put into question, but it too faded from the headlines by the mid-1970s. Again, I'm simplifying. As it did, an updated version of Myrdal's faith in the American creed, I don't think I'm simplifying here, and the impact of discrimination took shape in the mainstream press, marketing departments, and suburban living rooms. Few would have said that the country had fulfilled its founding promises, or that it had cashed that check Martin Luther King talked about in front of the Lincoln Memorial. But in the post-civil rights moment, especially in creative class circles, to use Richard Florida's apt phrase for Starbucks' early adapters, the dream focused increasingly on that single line from King's speech, where he looked forward to the day that his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. As this became the benchmark for race relations, the problem was no longer the law or unfair economic and social structures. It was personal prejudice, the wrong-headed thinking by some that race mattered, and that it explained differences in human behavior and character. Universalism ruled the day in the post-civil rights era, with many white Americans insisting that race didn't matter, but racism did. Recalling Myrdal, racism in this view was posed as a moral issue rather than a political one. It was a personal failing, even a sign of backwardness rather than a civic issue, or the culmination of tenacious exclusionary historical forces. Once people changed how they thought, once they got rid of their out-of-date views, society would move forward. No political intervention, no new laws, no social change necessary. Yet once the civil rights struggle shifted, for some, from marches and rallies to private thoughts and attitudes, the question became, how could you show that you were moral and modern? How could you demonstrate your lack of prejudice, and that for you, race didn't matter? Quite often, to show how you felt, race mattered. Hence the importance to some, though certainly not all, of a vote for an African American presidential candidate. Starbucks provided its customers with a quiet, everyday way to symbolically show to others and themselves that race didn't matter. Patrons could do this by shopping with a company that played African American music, hired African American executives, opened stores in historically African American neighborhoods, and welcomed African American customers. But like with Obama, at least part of his appeal, race emerged as an important way of saying that race didn't matter. No wonder then, as a researcher for UrbanSpoon.com uncovered, that Obama ran strongest in the states with the highest concentrations of Starbucks stores. That's where he found many of his white suburban supporters sipping lattes. All right, diversity isn't simply a mirage at Starbucks. Where diverse people live in city centers and inner-ring suburbs, Starbucks draws a diverse crowd, and that's part of its appeal. On a research trip to New York, I walked into the 4,000 square foot Starbucks in Astor Place with Mark Gobet. Dressed from head to toe in various shades of black, the French-born marketing expert looked around the room and smiled. "Look at this place," he said, waving his arms from side to side. "There's a black person over there. Over there are a couple of Russians. Oh, and a few Asians. I love this place," he said to me. The diversity that excited Gobet and gave Starbucks value to him is not just a New York thing. At the Starbucks in Ballackinwood, a stop on the mainline train route going west out of Philadelphia, African American salesmen in snappy suits stand in front of Orthodox Jews, pecking with their tallahs pecking out of their shirts, waiting to give their orders to a jolly order of French barista. In Camden Town, a gritty hipster section in North London, all kinds of people pass through the store. Men and women from France, Germany, the Caribbean, Asian subcontinent, Africa, Ireland, and even England. Starbucks workers are perhaps even more diverse. That was a joke. Starbucks workers are perhaps even more diverse than the customers. I've met Russian, African American, Latino, Asian, Arab, South Indian, Pacific, and Turkish blue-haired Gen Xers, bass players in garage bands, linguistics graduate students, no history graduate students, aspiring actors, and one-time radicals who've worked behind the counter serving coffee and muffins. I even met a Mormon employee once. She wouldn't do an online interview with me because she didn't want her devout parents to know that she was pushing coffee.